I'm here with Richard Heinberg, Senior Fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute, author of a number of books, including The Party's Over, Oil War and the Fate of Industrial Societies, Powerdonw, Options and Actions for a Post-Carbon World, The Oil Depletion Protocol, A Plan to Avert Oil Wars, Peak Everything, Waking Up to the Century of Declines, Blackout, Coal, Climate, and the Last Energy Crisis, and more. Richard, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Aaron. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for asking. Richard, what's on your mind nowadays?
Well, right now I'm working on an article on the global food supply in light of the coronavirus pandemic, and I think there are reasons for real concern that this could be. I mean, obviously we're already in the middle of a crisis, but sort of the next dimension of the crisis might have to do with what we eat.
What sort of concerns do you have? I mean, are you seeing things happening already?
Yes, we are seeing things happen already. Now, a little bit of background. First of all, our food system was almost designed for failure already. I mean, it's just like the pandemic. I mean, public health authorities have been warning us for years or maybe even decades that a global pandemic was increasingly likely. Same thing with the food system. People who understand and study food systems have been telling us, look, the way we're doing this is asking for trouble. I mean, we grow all our food using fossil fuels for inputs as chemical inputs for fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides. We transport food all over the globe using fossil fuel for transportation fuel. Then we use it for packaging and processing and so on. And of course, fossil fuels are non-renewable, depleting products, and using them alters the climate. So that's an unsustainable situation from the get-go. Then we've created long global supply chains that are brittle, and on and on and on. Anyway, the coronavirus crisis is tearing at that system on all fronts. Farm workers are vulnerable to the virus itself, getting sick, and of course, farm workers who have been declared essential workers are also in many cases so-called illegals and vulnerable to being rounded up and deported. We've closed the border with Mexico, which means that legal seasonal workers or documented workers can't go back and forth now. We have situations where countries are shutting off their exports. Ports are being closed because the port workers, people who load and unload ships, are getting sick or don't want to get sick. We have situations where restaurants are closing in droves. New York Times is estimating that 70% of restaurants may not reopen after the crisis. They may be bankrupt, just as farmers are going bankrupt in droves. So if all these restaurants and schools are closed, that means that the buyers who typically buy food in bulk for these outlets, the big Cisco and the big middlemen, aren't buying. So tons and tons of food are going to waste. It's rotting in the fields or being destroyed by plowed under by farmers. Meanwhile, we have a crisis of affordability. People who don't have money can't afford to buy food, even if it's there. And of course, millions of people are out of work suddenly. So this is a brewing crisis. And unless somebody steps in to take charge of this system and reorganize it, we could have people going hungry in very large numbers over the next few months.
What sort of solutions do you see that that could be put in place, Richard?
Well, the best solutions would be ones that address the pre-existing problems with the food system. I talked about how it was globalized and depended on long fossil fuel supply chains. Well, if we could relocalize our food system to a substantial extent, which would mean supporting local farmers, local food banks, local uh, warehouses and kitchens, and the whole parts of the system that can be localized. That would be, really, really helpful and significant. And there are farmers who are, getting together and forming local CSAs to deliver food to people who need it. So, people are coming to the rescue. People growing more of their own food is also an important solution. It's not going to totally solve the problem, but we are seeing, runs on local plant nurseries. People are buying up, organic seeds and plant starts and topsoil and everything else you need to garden. Baker Creek Seed Company, which is the nation's premier supplier of heirloom organic seeds, is not doing business right now because they're all sold out for the season. So we're seeing that happen. Then the affordability problem is something that needs to be addressed. There's people are enrolling in the SNAP program, the food stamp program, at record numbers. And so that program needs to be bolstered, and this should be a big priority for Congress and the president. But also at the state level and locally, we need to be making sure that everyone has access to the food that exists. Right now, there is no actual shortage of food. It's all a problem of distribution. That may change as time goes on. The most likely scenario is one in which, well-off Americans will find that specialty foods and processed foods disappear from the store shelves and get more expensive. But we don't want this to get to a situation where basic staples are not available, because then we get into actual, sort of famine territory. And these are the kinds of conditions that bring down government. So political leaders have every reason to take this seriously. And if they don't, that's the greatest sign of incompetence of all.
I've been seeing this idea of victory gardens. It's kind of sounds like maybe you're saying victory gardens are something that need to come back.
Absolutely. We had victory gardens in both world wars, and they were extremely successful. People participated in the program enthusiastically and produced a very large percentage of the country's, mostly vegetables, but also fruits and eggs. So keeping chickens in your backyard is a great thing to do. My wife and I have done it for the last 10 years, and we've gotten to know our chickens very well. And they produce wonderful eggs for us. And it's great to have that, tangible connection with your own food and where it comes from. But sharing food with neighbors is really important, because as we in California found out over the last few years with the wildfires, if things start to go wrong, your neighbors are really your first line of defense. If you know your neighbors and have good reciprocal relationships with them, you stand a much better chance of getting through a crisis situation than if you're just out there on your own. So sharing food is a really great way of building friendships with the people around you.
What should people be buying right now? I mean, like at this minute, where should they be focusing their spending power and their buying power?
Well, hoarding food, you can make a good case if there's the possibility of food shortages coming up, that hoarding food is a really bad idea, because it puts even more stress on the system. It's one of those self-reinforcing feedbacks, right? If the food system starts to look shaky, what people do is they go out and they panic buy, which makes the food system even shakier and causes more people to go out and do more panic buying. So I don't want to publicly advocate that, but at the same time, if you find situations where there are bulk foods available that are easily stored, it's not a bad idea to fill up your pantry.
And then it sounds like not just that being short-term planning, but also long-term planning as far as growing food as well. Are there certain ways that people should be, I mean, just the typical garden, or are there things they should be looking in specific, permaculture, things like that?
Oh, permaculture is a system for food growing, and actually for a lot more than that. That was designed back in the 1970s for exactly a moment like this. Also, biointensive is a way of gardening that is, as the name suggests, it's growing a lot of stuff in a small area by intercropping, growing plants together that support one another. So these are the kinds of things people really should be looking into. And there's lots of literature available, as well as classes. Of course, right now, face-to-face contact in classes is not such a good idea, but there's tremendous amount of information on the internet and in books. So yeah, permaculture and biointensive are terrific.
I'm wondering, this sounds kind of like something that's happened in countries before. I seem to recall something that happened in Cuba, the special period. Is that similar, would you say?
Well, in some ways. I mean, the special period was caused when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Soviet Union had been exporting oil to Cuba at very, very low cost. So Cuba became extremely dependent on oil for its agricultural system. It had big Soviet tractors and used a lot of chemicals on the soil and so on. So when the Soviet Union crashed, suddenly Cuba didn't have any oil and had to completely reorganize its food system. And the way it did so was actually quite successful and could serve as a model for what we need to do now, because they relocalized their food system. They started growing more food in the cities, in Havana. Lots of people started growing gardens wherever they could. They started reintroducing animal agriculture. In other words, draft animals pulling plows instead of big tractors. They started using different forms of transportation that were much more energy efficient, and so on. So, you know, right now we don't seem to have an oil crisis because price of oil is very low, and with not many people driving to work, there's lots of gasoline and oil to be had. But nevertheless, the kinds of solutions that Cuba turned to are, you know, very apt for this situation as well.
Before we wrap up, any other thoughts on the food supply system and what the road forward looks like?
Right. Well, this is going to be a make or break situation for our global food system. It's not going to emerge, just as, you know, the global economy is not going to emerge from this moment looking the way it did 6 months ago. Same thing with the food system. The food system was already set up for disaster at some point or another. Well, disaster, maybe not of the kind that most people were foreseeing, has arrived. And, you know, for better or worse, the food system is going to emerge very different. Now, it could emerge actually even more lopsided. It could be a situation where the big producers buy up the smaller ones, the even more family farms disappear and get bought up by, you know, big agribusiness companies. Small food producers get bought up by large ones as the smaller ones go bankrupt and so on. And we could end up with a food system that's even more consolidated and even more vulnerable to the next crisis. That would be a tragedy. You know, they say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Well, you know, we have a crisis, so let's make the most use of it by redesigning the system in a way that makes it more resilient over the long run, so that it's less prone to break down the next time something happens.
All right, well, thank you so much. I think what I'm taking from this is that just kind of be aware of food, make sure I've got some money to buy food now in the future, maybe store up some staples, start looking at getting the garden in, look into the permaculture ideas and the special period idea.
And
Thank you.
start talking to your neighbors. Have a get together. Well, I guess you can't get together face to face with your neighbors. Damn it. But you know, talk to your neighbors and share what you can.
Excellent. So again, this was an interview with Richard Heinberg. He is a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute, author of many books, including his newest one, actually out in 2016, Our Renewable Future, Laying the Path for 100% Clean Energy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Richard.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Aaron.